When you hear the name Albert Einstein, what comes to mind? For a lot of us, it's Germany, right? E equals mc squared, the Nobel Prize, it all feels so deeply tied to German science. But what if I told you that his relationship with his home country got so bad, so broken, that he actually said goodbye to Germany? Not just once, but twice. Yeah, let's dive into this incredible story of principle, politics, and a final painful break.
That's right. 2 separate times in his life, he made the huge decision to completely cut ties with his homeland. So, what on earth could lead someone to do that? Not once, but twice. To really get it, we need to look at the timeline of this fractured relationship.
Okay, so here's the roadmap. Our story really hinges on 3 key moments. It all starts way back in 1896 with a pretty radical choice made by a teenage Einstein. Then we jump to 1914 when he makes a surprising return to Berlin. And it all leads up to the final, no-turning-back break in 1933. Let's start with that first goodbye.
All right, let's unpack that first goodbye. To really get it, we have to go back to when Einstein was just a kid. And this wasn't some rash teenage decision. It was a huge statement from a young guy who already saw the world in a very, very different way.
The key thing here is his age. I mean 16. At an age when most of us are worried about homework, Einstein was taking a stand on geopolitics. For him, this was all about principle. He was a deeply committed pacifist, and the whole idea of serving in the German military, which he saw as rigid, militaristic, and demanding blind obedience, was just something he could not do. It went against his core values. And look, this decision had very real consequences. For 5 whole years, Albert Einstein was officially stateless. He was literally a citizen of nowhere. It wasn't until 1901 that he finally became a Swiss citizen. It just goes to show you how serious he was about his beliefs, even when it made his own life way more complicated.
But the story takes a twist. Years later, the very same country he turned his back on came calling. Germany wanted its genius back. And this really sets the stage for a very complicated and ultimately a doomed reconciliation.
And this slide just lays out the massive contradiction he was living. On the one hand, he was the toast of the town, right? Director of the super prestigious Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Physics, the most famous scientist in the world. The German establishment was rolling out the red carpet for him. But on the other hand, he never stopped being a critic. He was one of a tiny handful of German academics to speak out against World War I, and he was constantly clashing with the country's intense nationalism. He was an insider and an outsider, all at the same time.
Well, a balancing act like that, it was never going to last. The rise of the Nazi regime was about to change everything. It would transform Einstein from a respected, if sometimes challenging critic, into a declared enemy of the state. This was the point of no return.
And you have to understand, with his global fame and his unwavering principles, Einstein was an inevitable target for the Nazis. He was the walking, talking embodiment of everything their twisted ideology stood against. He wasn't just some opponent, he was a symbol they felt they had to destroy.
So why was he public enemy number 1 in their eyes? Well, it was a perfect storm. His pacifism was a direct challenge to their warmongering. His Jewish heritage, of course, made him a central target for their disgusting anti-Semitic propaganda. And as a brilliant, free-thinking intellectual who wasn't afraid to speak his mind, he was a fundamental threat to their goal of total control. In their eyes, he was the perfect enemy.
And the attacks got ugly, and they got personal, and very, very public. Physicists, backed by the Nazis, started campaigns to try and discredit his work, calling relativity Jewish physics. His books were tossed onto those massive, infamous bonfires. This wasn't a political debate anymore. This was an existential threat to him, to his work, and to his people.
So all of this, it's a powder keg waiting to explode. And it does, in 1933, leading to the final, permanent break, a decision that was forced on him while he was thousands of miles away from home. And man, when it all fell apart, it happened fast. Einstein was in the United States on a teaching visit when Hitler seized power. Soon after, his home in Berlin was raided by the Nazis. Then his property, his bank accounts, everything was confiscated. The message couldn't have been clearer: you can't come home. From the safety of the U.S., he walked into the German consulate and gave up his citizenship for the second and final time.
And there's really no better way to understand how final this was than to hear it from the man himself. As he was getting ready to settle into his new life at Princeton, he made this declaration. It wasn't just a statement, it was a verdict on what Germany had become.
But what about after the war? You know, the Nazi regime is gone. You think, okay, maybe now he'll reconcile. Maybe he'll go back. Well, let's take a look at the aftermath,
because it shows just how deep this wound really was. And this, for me, is maybe the most powerful part of the entire story. Even after the war ended, his position never changed, not one bit. He got tons of invitations to come back, to rejoin German scientific academies. He turned every single one of them down. For Einstein, the break wasn't just with the Nazis. He held the broader society responsible for the horrors of the Holocaust, and he felt he could never, ever again be officially associated with the German state.
So what do we make of all this? Einstein's story leaves us with a huge question, one that is just as relevant now as it was then. He loved German culture, the language, the music, the philosophers who shaped his own mind. But he could not and would not stand by the actions of the German nation. It's a complicated legacy that really makes you think, doesn't it? It leaves us with a tough question. Where do you draw the line between loyalty to a culture and opposition to a nation?